Imagine 500 horsepower Supras, Skylines, RX-7 battling it out on tight and technical circuits, all while 300 horsepower Civics and Celicas barrel into apexes on the same track at the same time. Japanese touring car racing is some of the most exciting and intense motorsports that you've probably never watched. But it took Japan 60 years of playing catch up to Europe and America to get there. So let's dig into the tumultuous rise of pro racing in Japan to see how the Japanese found a way to create the most thrilling races in the world, and how their rapid success may have actually shot themselves in the foot. I'm Guff, this is Albon, let's get started. The origin of pro racing in Japan goes back nearly 100 years. Back then, Europe had the Brooklyn circuit, America had Indianapolis, and Australia had Aspendale. And Japan, well, Japan had nothing. If you wanted to race a car, you could either do it illegally on the streets, or you could do it on a horse track when the bookies were at home. So even though car manufacturing was growing at a rapid pace in the country, when it came to the world of motorsports, Japan was falling behind fast. Until one gearhead decided to do something about it. Gunji Fujimoto was a Japanese-born car enthusiast who was raised in Seattle. And living in the States, he was a feverish fan of the Indianapolis 500 and the Elgin National Trophy. But when he moved back to Japan in the 1920s, he was severely disappointed with the lack of any professional racing back home. There were plenty of car enthusiasts in Japan, but with only horse derby tracks and empty parking lots to race on, the Japanese public never truly experienced motorsports. So Gunji took it upon himself and raised money to correct this horrible oversight. And nearly a decade later, in 1936, he opened Japan's first permanent racetrack, Tamagawa Speedway, just outside of Tokyo. It was a circle track reminiscent of the racetracks that Gunji raced back in America. And well, the people went wild. It didn't take long for Tamagawa Speedway to become the home of Japan's biggest races, and also attract some of Japan's most iconic car nuts. A 29-year-old Soichiro Honda raced at the inaugural race in 1936. He and his brother piloted a turbocharged Ford and raced it out against Bugattis and Bentleys. But for Soichiro, that race didn't go exactly as planned. Midway through the race, they hit another car, flipped, and were launched outside of their car and onto the track. Somehow they both survived, although with a couple of injuries. And even though that meant that their racing careers were pretty much over, it was at Tamagawa Speedway that Soichiro Honda fell in love with racing and later decided that the Honda brand needed to build race cars. Over the next 25 years, the Japanese racing industry was beginning to put down roots and become a viable part of the worldwide racing stage. And as the French built the famous Nagaro circuit in 1960, Japan countered with the legendary Suzuka circuit. And a year later, when Formula One came to Watkins Glen in America, Japan opened up Fuji Speedway at the foothills of Mount Fuji. Then there was Tsukuba opening in 1970, Atsu in 1972, Sugo in 1975, and over the next decade, dozens more. Japan's motorsports was growing at a rapid rate, and professional and amateur racers alike finally were getting the circuits they needed to get their racing fix. But racetracks were just one part of the recipe. The other ingredient was, of course, the race cars. The winner of Japan's first Grand Prix at Suzuka was the 1963 SP310 Datsun Fairlane. But it wasn't just Datsuns on the grid. Mazda, Suzuki, Volkswagen, Honda, Triumph, and MG all raced there too. Japanese racing was on such a tear that many major manufacturers were taking advantage of the empty throne and trying to claim the crown. And the league that everybody wanted to compete in, well, that was the Japanese Touring Car Championship. And this was fantastic racing, especially for the 1960s. But the car that quickly became the king of the series was none other than Nissan's C10 Skyline GTR. It was such a quick contender that many teams on the grid refused to drive anything else. And the Skyline GTR won every single race in 1969, 1970, and 1971. And the craziest part, well, that wasn't even the GTR's most dominant run ever, but we'll get to that one later. That first-gen GTR would soon be dethroned by the granddaddy of another famous Japanese lineage, the Mazda RX-3. Mazda's Savannah RX-3 was powered by the original A-series rotary engine, and even though it didn't make power like the Skyline, it was nearly 300 kilograms lighter. And that weight advantage is what led to the RX-3 dominating nearly every single touring car championship that it entered, taking 100 victories by 1976. Now, all of this is pretty awesome, but here's the thing. As Japanese motorsports grew into the 80s, racing in other countries was growing exponentially faster. America had NASCAR and kart, the predecessor to Indy. Europe had Formula One and Le Mans, all series that had global audiences with some of the best cars and best drivers in the world. And so the Japan Automobile Federation, the organization that managed Japanese racing, had to add some spice to their racing series to keep up. So in 1983, after a couple years of cooking, the All-Japan Endurance Championship was born. Just like how this segue to our sponsor was born. Thank you to Morgan & Morgan for sponsoring this episode.
This is Bob. Bob is a mechanic working 12-hour shifts on rusty jalopies for a shop with 2 stars on Google. Bob ain't a rich man, but he's a good man. So when a careless shop owner leaves 5W40 all over the floor and Bob slips, falls, and lands butt first into a 00 Phillips screwdriver, he needs somebody who can fight on his side and pay for that expensive tear in his tush. That somebody is Morgan. And Morgan. And Morgan. Oh, wait, no, there's only 2 Morgan. Morgan & Morgan is America's largest injury law firm with more than 800 lawyers and 4,000 case staff ready to fight for your behind. But Bob is worried because he doesn't have the cash to pay for expensive legal fees. But worry no more, because Morgan & Morgan doesn't charge you any sign-up fees or other upfront costs. The fee is free unless you win. But Bob still feels bad. He doesn't want to sue his boss, even if his boss hasn't actually paid him real money for the last 6 months. But Bob, when you sue for an injury, you're not suing your D-bag boss, you're suing his insurance company, who have way too much money as it is. There's no reason to feel bad for getting the compensation you deserve. So if you've been a victim in a car accident, medical malpractice, workplace injury, or any other personal injury, hit the link in the description to get Morgan & Morgan to fight for you. Bob did, and he sure is thankful Morgan & Morgan had his back and his butt.
The Japan Endurance class, later known as the Prototype class, was meant for just that. Prototype cars that qualified for Group C and IMSA racing. But the series didn't expand in the way that Japan had hoped. The budgets for these cars grew too high too quickly, and the ROI for manufacturers that were competing just wasn't worth the rising costs. And just one look at these race cars and you can imagine how quickly the budget ballooned. The grid was filled with an abundance of badass machines. Nissan alone had the March 83G, Fairlady Z's, Le Mans spec prototype. Toyota had their 83C race cars alongside Celicas. Then there was the plethora of Mazda RX-7s and the amazing Mazda Speed 717C. And these were just the big manufacturer names. But here was the problem. Most of these cars were modified to the point of being unrecognizable as the street cars that they once came from. And for Japanese fans, that just meant that they couldn't really relate to the series. Local spectators wanted to see the cars that they drove every day battling it out for the gold on the circuit. And so the series was just never popular, and the All-Japan Endurance Championship begrudgingly went on for the next decade, with the fastest car there being a Porsche, not even a homebred Japanese car. But quietly in the background, Japan's racing organizers were already working to change Japanese motorsports forever. In 1985, the All-Japan Touring Car Championship was launched, and this championship became home to some of the most infamous Japanese racing legends ever. And that was thanks to this league's acceptance of Group A race cars. Race cars that had to have production models cruising the streets, cars that you and I could have drove. The All-Japan Championship had 3 divisions, all dominated by different platforms. Division 3 was held for cars with under 1600cc displacement. This is where you found one of the most legendary Honda Civics of all time, the Mugen Motul Honda Civic. In 1987, this EA Civic won every single freaking race of Division 3. And if that wasn't enough to convince you of how insane this car was, it even took pole position overall in a race with the faster Division 1 and Division 2 cars. Yes, a Civic took pole position against cars with twice its engine displacement. Speaking of which, Division 2 cars had engine displacements between 1601cc and 2500cc. But this class was completely dominated by BMW E30s. As in, like, there were only E30s competing in this entire division. For some reason, because of the rules of Division 2, it was really the only car that Japanese race teams cared to race. So let's forget Division 2 and move on to Division 1. Division 1 cars had to have engine displacements larger than 2500cc. And those rules are what led to the most monumental era in Japanese motorsports history. Because Division 1 is where Godzilla
was born.
At the time, Nissan was suffering from a long run of very underwhelming sports cars. The last GTR worth a damn on the circuit was way back in 1972. The C110 GTR that came after that never raced, and the R31 was just a little bit underwhelming. Nissan was desperate to get back into the limelight, and the new All Japan Touring Car Championship seemed like the perfect stage to do it. So from its conception, the new R32 Skyline GTR was designed for competition. Because of the Division 1 rules, a 2.6 liter was thrown in from the factory, and the class homologation rules meant that the GTR trim would qualify, which not only meant twin turbos boosted up to nearly 600 horsepower, but also the Atessa ETS all-wheel drive system. And once the R32 GTR took its place on the grid, competition was all but over with. The GTR platform destroyed every single race that it entered from 1990 to 1992. The Division 1 class almost became exclusively an R32 class because there were just no other cars that could keep up with how fast that Nissan was. And we're not talking about just being the overall winner every season. It won every single freaking race. All 29 races in 3 years. And it didn't stop at Japan for the R32. The GTR won the 91 24 Hours of Spa, and the R32 platform even competed in Australia and beat out every single Holden and V8 Ford there was at Bathurst. The GTR became too dominant, a larger-than-life figure, a monster from Japan that the world had no choice but to bend to. The GTR became Godzilla. That R32 Skyline was no doubt the biggest name in Japanese touring car history, with the most iconic GTR being from Calsonic, who were the winners of over half of those 29 GTR first place finishes. But the most important part of the GTR's dominance was that it wasn't just some prototype race car or an exotic supercar. This was the same 2.6 liter Nissan available at showroom floors across the country. Yeah, GTRs weren't the cheapest cars in the world, but Japan's top racing league had a podium full of cars that were real, tangible, approachable. You didn't need to be the richest man in the room to own the car that would take the gold every single weekend on your television set. And that was the beauty of the Japan Touring Car Championship and why it exploded in popularity in the 1990s. But in 1993, all of that changed. The Group A rules were thrown out the window by the JAF in place of a all-new Super Touring class. Super Touring cars were basically entirely different beasts than what came before it. Cars that the Japanese racing diehards historically had never connected with. And just like the classes that came before it, budgets became too big, logistics became too complicated, and factory teams were forced to drop out one by one until there was no competition left. The All Japan Touring Car Championship was dead. But the JAF weren't stupid. They knew this was coming, and they knew that people loved seeing modified street cars ripping down Fuji Speedway. So once the Super Touring series died, they were quick to make an alternative for fans, and they called it the All Japan Grand Touring Car Championship, also known as JGTC. And well, JGTC was everything you could hope for. As great as Godzilla was in the old series, seeing the same car win over and over and over and over again was just kind of boring. And so JGTC was formed to prevent a one-make domination from ever happening again. The rules would evolve year over year to keep racing exciting and ensure that competition was close. There were imposed limits on power and weight penalties given out to the fastest cars. Remember all those JDM legends that you spent countless hours and credits grinding in Gran Turismo for? Well, those cars were meant for JGTC. In its early seasons, JGTC had two classes, GT1 and GT2. And the winner of the inaugural All Japan Grand Touring Car Championship, well, it was a Calsonic GTR. Now I know, I said the whole point of this race was to make it more competitive and stop GTRs from winning all the time. But well, this wasn't that Calsonic GTR. This was an entirely new GTR, but still had Kageyama, the same driver behind the wheel. But the cars alongside the Calsonic GTR were just as awesome. Keiichi Tsuchiya and Team Kunimitsu were in their 911 RSR. Team Sard raced a 4-banger Toyota Supra. Then there were the Blitz and Shift Point Supras, both brave enough to race with the Pig Iron 2JZ. Hell, Team Tyson had a Porsche 962 and a Ferrari F40. There was even a Lamborghini Countach on the grid. And did I mention, this was just the GT1 class. The GT2 class, albeit slower, was just as impressive. With 911 turbos, FCRX7s, Skyline GTS and GTSRs, E30s, 964 turbos, and the JAF made sure to monitor every race closely and make adjustments wherever necessary. But out the gate, GT1 cars were starting to become too expensive to maintain and operate. And so the JAF, thinking quickly, adapted again. They ditched GT1 and GT2 classes and decided to make two new classes, GT300 and GT500. And at least at the beginning, the difference was easy. GT300 cars had 300 horsepower, GT500 cars had 500 horsepower. And the best part was, both classes took to the racetrack at the exact same time. So overtaking wasn't a matter of if, but when. And so JGTC racing was always a thrill to watch. Plus, to prevent another Godzilla takeover, weight penalties were added to the regulation. For every point you scored in the series, you added 2 kilograms of weight to your car. So if you had 45 points going into the final race of the season, you had to add 90 kilograms of ballast to your car. And that meant that the field was always close, with fierce battles between drivers at any point of the race. And by 1996, the grid looked nothing like it had before. No longer was it just 12 different colors of GTR. There were Ferrari F40s, Honda NSX-Rs, Porsche 911 GT2s and Carrera RSRs, Dodge Vipers, FDRX7s, Lamborghini Diablos. McLaren, for example, was on top of the world at the time. They had just won at Le Mans and built the McLaren F1 GTR to better compete with the Porsche GT1. And a few of those McLaren F1 GTRs made it overseas to Kamuichi Go, the founder of Team Go. And fully backed by the McLaren factory team, Team Go won the 1996 JGTC season. But that season was the first and only time that a non-Japanese brand would ever win JGTC. Team Go and McLaren actually dropped out of JGTC the very next year, citing that they were being forced out by the Japanese manufacturers that had a grip on JAF regulations. McLaren even said that the Japanese manufacturers couldn't stand to be embarrassed on their home turf. But boo-hoo, yeah sure, maybe there was some sketchy stuff going on, but can we please talk about the Supras? Specifically, the most important Supra of all time, the Castrol Tom's Toyota Supra GT. That's right, just like so many of the greats that lived inside of my Gran Turismo 2 garage, this car was born to compete in JGTC. And well, depending on who you ask, the Castrol Tom Supra is arguably even more iconic than that Calsonic GTR. You see, Toyota was sick of Nissan winning, and they needed to do something about it. And they did so by being clever. You see, JGTC requires that a car's engine be made by the original manufacturer. So you couldn't go around swapping small block Chevys into Supras and just winning every race. And mainly it prevented teams from building brand new, unfair engines from the ground up. It was the reason why Nissan had to stick with the RB26 in the later generations of Skyline. But technically, it never said that you had to use the engine that was made for that car. And so Toyota saw this little loophole and decided to do something a little sacrilegious. They ditched the 2JZ. Sure, the 2J is legendary for its insane power potential, but it was also an incredibly heavy iron block inline 6. And so in its place was the 3S GTE. Yes, the smaller 4-cylinder turbo from the 90s Celica and MR2. Of course, this 3S was nothing like the one you had in your Mr. 2. This was the same engine found in the rally cars that dominated WRC. Pairing a lighter engine with a light car like the Tom Supra meant that they were able to weigh in at just 1,150 kilograms. Add in the fact that they were able to squeeze out 480 horsepower and 470 pound-feet of torque from that little 4-banger, and they had a recipe for success. The Castrol Tom Supra ended up winning the 97 GT500 championship, cementing its place in Japanese racing history. And finally, after decades, Japanese motorsports had become so popular that it was finally being mentioned in the same breath as open-wheel racing in Europe and stock car racing in America. And with spectatorship growing rapidly, race days quickly evolved into race weeks. The races were full-on events. Huge grandstands, paddock passes, driver Q&A sessions, live talk shows, team stores, interactive booths, they were everywhere. Tens of thousands of fans were showing up to every single race. And because of the soaring growth, it was finally time for JGTC to go overseas. So in 2000, they hosted their first special race in Malaysia. Now, special race was important because it meant that it wasn't officially part of the season race calendar. And that was all due to a technicality. If the Malaysian race had become a part of the regular season schedule, then JGTC would lose its national championship status under FIA rules. Because, well, now it would be international. So the Malaysian race at Sepang, despite its popularity, would stay as a special race. But the JGTC spectacle just kept growing and growing. And eventually Malaysia became an integral part of the JGTC calendar. Plus, JGTC was experimenting in America, hosting special exhibitions in California. And in 2004, all of it came to a head when JGTC basically became too big for its britches. The All Japan Grand Touring Car Championship outgrew Japan, and under FIA rules, they were forced to relabel as an international racing series. Now, that might not seem like a big deal, but being an international racing series meant that the JAF would have to hand over the reins to the FIA, because now it was international and out of Japan's jurisdiction. By 2005, JGTC would be rebranded as the new International Super GT, and Malaysia became part of the normal race schedule, which was awesome at first, especially when you consider the most successful car there was the 20B Arya RX-7, but the new Super GT organizers were relentless in their need to expand. And by 2014, Malaysia was replaced with races in Thailand, and then made plans to host races in China and South Korea. But while the FIA-backed organizers wanted to grow Super GT at all costs, the fans, well, they had different ideas. Japanese fans once again felt that the homegrown appeal that drew them to JGTC was disappearing with Super GT. And that compounded with the fact that Super GT was struggling to find its identity beyond the Pacific. The Chinese and South Korean races, well, they never came to fruition. But despite that, the organizers just kept pushing and pushing for expansion, and now had plans to reach Europe. Super GT decided to change their regulations to allow for DTM cars to participate with GT500. But by the time this was finalized in 2020, DTM switched to GT3 regulations after a major manufacturer exodus in Germany. And this meant that, once again, Super GT had failed to reach another new market, all while continuing to lose grip on the Japanese fans that were their foundation. Now, going into the 2023 season, there are no races scheduled outside of Japan, and no plans for that to change. Super GT is back to where it started with JGTC, 100% Japanese. And I'll be honest, I don't know if this is a good or bad outcome for Super GT, but it's important to understand that the best of touring car racing in Japan was always unmistakably Japanese. Japan's most awe-inspiring cars, battling it out against each other, backed by Japan's most infamous tuning houses, all on Japan's most iconic circuits. And today, in a time when time attack and drifting are at feverish levels of popularity, I can't help but reminisce about those red and green livery Toyota Supras, those dangerously quick Skyline GTRs, those fire-breathing Mazda RX-7s, and hope that Japan once again figures out a formula to bring Japanese racing into a new golden era. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on Discord to tell us about your favorite JGTC cars. I don't know about you, but I think it's about time I get off this 5-gallon bucket and load up a little Gran Turismo. Gran Turismo 3, that is, the greatest Gran Turismo. I'm not an idiot. I'll see you guys in the next one.